One day in the 1880s, a group of people were walking towards a village in Shanxi province. In the sedan chair wasn't an ordinary man, but a famous and distinguished one, Rishengchang. Zuo was an important government official. He was transferred back to the capital and appointed as the Minister of Defense for his outstanding military exploits in repressing the Taiping Rebellion and the Northeast Rebellion. For now, the sedan chair stopped in front of Chiao's compound. An old man rushed out to greet them. He was the master of Chiao's compound and the richest man in Qi County, Chiao. Chiao was now over 60, but he was still head of the Chiao family. He had taken over the family business as a young man. Due to his extraordinary commercial talent, his family business had flourished day by day ever since, and the Chiao family eventually became the largest and richest family in Shanxi. At that time, it was a great honor to meet Rishengchang. What was more unbelievable was that Zuo called Chiao elder brother. So how was it that a Shanxi merchant and an important official called each other brothers? In today's Qi County, we can still see a grand and spectacular building complex in the village of Chiao. Shaped like a castle, the compound has streets as its three sides and is enclosed by brick walls. There are 313 rooms altogether. This is Chiao's compound. A couplet on the gate of the compound reads, "Control desires to advocate justice. Accumulate virtues to write articles. It's said that the couplet was given to Chiao by Zuo as a gift.
什么叫损人欲啊？就是克制自己，不能让自个儿的欲望一味的贪婪，还要尊重别人。什么叫取道德文章，仁义礼智信？用孔子的教导，自觉的约束自己。
Zuo was an ambitious official, but he was born at a time full of turbulence. He was fully aware that articles advocating morals could not prevent the empire from going into decline. To get through the crisis, the government needed the strong power of private capital. This was when Shanxi merchants were embarking on the road to rescuing the empire through political measures. In 1867, a group of soldiers was marching towards the northwest. The commander of the army was Rishengchang, who was then the governor-general of Shanxi and Gansu provinces. At the time, a tide of uprisings was sweeping across the Gansu province. Russia had its eye on China's northwestern frontier. Bearing heavy responsibilities, Zuo led an army in person to suppress uprisings in Shanxi and Gansu, and then sent troops to Xinjiang. But this experienced general was faced with a formidable difficulty.
那么左宗棠大军要平叛，他需要军饷，吃喝拉撒，这一切都用军饷来解决。政府没钱，政府钱不够。
Having recently gone through the Taiping Rebellion and the Second Opium War, the government had run out of money. The military expenditure for Zuo's expeditionary force made the government's financial burden even heavier. Army supplies and provisions usually couldn't be delivered on time. Seeing the soldiers who had followed him for many years so hungry made Zuo very worried. Having no other option, he called the generals together to work out a solution. At that moment, one man put forward a suggestion, i.e., borrow some money from the Shanxi merchants to overcome the difficulties. It was clearly a major decision to borrow money from a private business. Would the government allow such a thing to happen? The first contact between the Shanxi banks and the government had taken place 4 years before Zuo began suppressing rebellion. In 1862, to suppress the Taiping Rebellion, the emperor issued an edict requisitioning more than 2 million taels of silver from all provinces as military expenditures. The money was to be delivered to Beijing before October 26th. Guangdong province alone had to hand in 1 million taels of silver. For the governor of Guangdong, it was an impossible mission. At that time, the Taiping Rebellion had brought turmoil to southern China. In the north, a peasant rebellion was also very active. To deliver so much silver under the rebel army's nose from the south to the north was extremely dangerous.
那么明清国家的这个货币，主流货币，它是白银。白银，既然是白银，那么老百姓上交税收是白银，政府给官员发工资、发军饷也都是白银。那么地方的税收要把白银要运到北京去，天下太平好办。那么天下一旦变乱，交通割断，这事就做不到了。
The governor of Guangdong came up with many plans to deliver the silver to Beijing safely. If the couriers made detours, they would obviously not arrive in Beijing on time. If they took the waterways and delivered the silver to the port of Tianjin by boat, the cost would be very high. If they remitted the silver via foreign banks, the bank's requirements were a little harsh. Just as the governor faced this dilemma, he was approached by a bank manager from Rishengchang.
那么在这种情况下，票号的优势显示出来了，汇通天下嘛，票号资金的力量很大啊。比如说广东税关叫粤海关，你多少税收要交到北京，你交到我广东票号这边，然后呢，一封信，北京的中央政府可以 到我北京的票号去取，这样把风险就解决了啊！你也完成了任务了，国家也有相应来解决问题了。
This is the former site of Zhicheng Xinbank in Shanxi. It was established in the 17th century, and its branches covered the whole country. Being on good terms with local officials, the Guangzhou branch had lent money to the Guangdong government many times before. But it was the first time for it to remit expenditure required by the central government. The deadline had passed, yet no silver had been delivered to Beijing. The central government had to approve Guangdong governor's request of making the payment through a private bank branch in Guangzhou. Without any misfortunes, 1 million taels of silver was delivered to Beijing safely, and the government's urgent problem was solved. Soon afterwards, Fujian, Zhejiang, Hunan, Hubei, and other provinces all chose to transfer payments through private banks rather than delivering silver. Some major banks, including Wei Taihou, Tianqian Heng, and Xin Taihou, were also involved in the remittance business. Undertaking governmental remittance was a great leap forward in the history of the private bank's development. Not only did it bring in huge income, but also marked the beginning of cooperation between Shanxi banks and the government. Private banks could have dual benefits from this kind of remittance. On one hand, they charged a huge remittance fee. And on the other hand, in times of local government's financial crisis, they would pay on behalf of the government and charge a large amount of interest. From then on, more and more banks cast their eyes on the Forbidden City. The peasant uprisings and foreign invasions that happened from time to time made the bank operators realize that strong financial capability and smooth networks were not enough for private capital institutions. They had to find a strong and powerful backer, i.e., the government. Having been a court official for many years, Zuo Zongtang was very clear about the change in the relationship between the private and the government. When in great need of military expenditure for suppressing a rebellion in Xinjiang, he decided to borrow money from the banks, including the one owned by the Chiao family.
政府发给他的款项呢，往往不能按时按数到达指定地点，这样的话，他的军事行动、军需物资供应就是个很大的问题。所以就请票号来帮助。票号觉得给他汇兑款项呢，不仅能够赚个会费，在有些企业不能按时到达，票号就在垫汇，同时还可以赚取一重贷款利息。不仅有会费，有贷款利息，可以获得双重的收入，所以对票号来说也是非常合算的。
At that time, the Chiao family had become a well-known business family in Qi County, based on a variety of businesses. In the beginning, Dadao Xing, established by Chiao Zhiyong, was mainly involved in the tea business. It later also ran a remittance business, Having seen the huge profits associated with remittance, Chiao made remittance the main business, turning it into a bank. After receiving Zhuo's appeal for a loan, Chiao thought it was a rare opportunity. More than 10 years earlier, when the private banks were undertaking governmental remittance, the Dadao tea house had only been dealing in remittance as a side business. The Chiao family was missing a good opportunity to make profits. If this time they could win the trust of the government by lending money to Zhuo, it would be great for the family. Therefore, Chiao presented the money respectfully and without any hesitation. Between 1866 and 1881, Zhuo borrowed nearly 9 million taels of silver. Most of the money came from the Chiao family. The amount varied from 40,000 to 600,000 taels each time. With the wealthy Chiao family as backer, Zhuo never had to worry about military expenditure again. So after he returned in triumph from the northwestern battlefield, Zhuo made a detour to express his gratitude to Chiao Zhiyong.
后来新疆平叛结束了，新疆的事结束了，政府调左宗棠回北京做军机大臣。左宗棠从新疆回北京的过程中经过山西祁县，于是专程去乔家拜访对乔家来讲，这也是不得了的事啊。
In fact, apart from earning interest of almost 400,000 taels of silver, the Chiao family had also taken charge of arranging and purchasing all the military materials for Zhuo's army.
那么乔家帮助左宗棠做了不小的事情，也不能白做也希望有所回报。就是左宗棠在新疆那个大军，那么军饷的转运由乔家负责。
Having gained great profits from loan interest and the remittance of military expenditure, with shrewd business genius, Chiao realized that a great commercial opportunity was approaching. This is an ordinary street in Beijing. A long way down the lane is an ordinary compound. No one knows that here, over 100 years ago, rich merchants and renowned officials passed in and out. This was the Beijing branch of Dadao Tong Bank established by the Chiao family. In 1884, shortly after Zhuo had visited the Chiao family, the Dadao tea house remittance business was getting better and better. And its success even surpassed that of the original tea business. Therefore, its boss, Chiao, turned the tea house into a bank and changed the name to Dadao Tong. In the same year, he established another bank, calling it Dadao Heng. Under Chiao's management, both Dadao Tong and Dadao Heng became two of the largest private banks in China.
他是后来者后起之秀所以他可以大量的借鉴别人的经验借鉴别人的经营模式，就省了一番探索的功夫。 另外嘛，票号已经发展了几十年了，那么也培养了很多的人才。在票号发展的过程中，由于对形势的判断，或者由于内部的矛盾，总是会有好多的人要离开原来的票号，这就为他的发展，那么创造了一个很好的人才基础。
Among the managers who had made huge profits for the Chiao family, there was a man from Shanxi called Gao Yu. He was very important to the success of the Chiao family business, and even to the banking business as a whole. Born into a scholarly family at 15, Gao had joined a private bank opened by the Chiao family. When Dadao Tong was established, he was just an ordinary employee, but only a few years later, he had become the manager of its Beijing branch. Apart from its professional capabilities, Gao was very good at networking. He had made the acquaintance of many influential government officials.
过去政府的财政也自己管，但晚清发生了很大的变化，就是政府没有这个的银行，票号替他掌管了，所以他的整个的钱都交给票号。那么票号拿了钱就可以出去大量的发展业务吧，所以这就是为什么票号没有不重视跟官员来往的原因啊。所以这个高玉在这方面就很用心，也很擅长。
Based on his friendship with officials, Gao's bank branch won their trust. His branch even became an important institution where Beijing officials deposited their private money.
比如说，他跟一个叫焦尔逊的官员关系就特别熟，那么这个人最初是做地方官员，后来这个派到四川，又派到东北，又派到北京，那么关系特别熟悉了，走到哪里他就跟到哪里。
Gao collected a huge number of both public and private deposits and loaned the money to other places to make huge commercial profits. This action quietly changed the key profit point of private banks. Deposits and loans became an important source of income, and the proportion of remittance income declined to a great extent. However, just as Gao was putting great effort into operating Dadao Tong, a sea battle put the economy of the Qing Empire on the edge of collapse once again. On September 17, 1894, on the Yellow Sea, the two most powerful fleets in Asia, the Chinese Navy and the Japanese Navy, were engaged in fierce fighting. Five hours later, the war came to an end. The Chinese fleet was seriously damaged. The sea defensive line that the Qing Empire had spent over 20 years building had completely collapsed. After the war ended, Li Hongjiang, the representative of the Qing government, and Li Jingfang, the minister appointed by the Qing government to negotiate with Japan, signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki with the Japanese delegate Ito Hirobumi in the Shun Panro Ball in the Japanese city of Shimonoseki. According to the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Chinese government was required to pay Japan 230 million taels of silver in compensation. The first sum of compensation, 50 million taels of silver, was to be paid within 6 months of the treaty being signed. As for the rest of the compensation, Japan would charge an annual interest of 5%. The interest alone would amount to almost 30 million taels of silver, equivalent to 3 years' worth of the Chinese government's income. In desperation, the government decided to borrow money from foreign banks and turn the huge war compensation into a long-term debt. These are the bonds that the government used to borrow money from Britain and Germany in 1898. The bonds had 3 different face values: 25, 50, and 100 pounds. On each bond, the British and German banks noted the huge debt the government had to pay each year. The payback period ran from March 1st, 1899 until March 1st, 1943. When loaning the money, the foreign banks deliberately made things difficult for the government and took the opportunity to extort money. Their conditions were very harsh.
他首先借钱啊，他要打折扣，除了利息外打折扣。你借了个1两银子，实际上到手的呢可能只有8000。第二呢，他还附加一些政治条件，就是你那个借我这个钱，比如应得借款，你就必须要用英国人做海关税务司。 总税务司要把这个再作为一个借款的条件附在里面。
The huge external debt made the government's national treasury with nothing but emptiness and colossal debts. The naturally conservative government had to make a reckless move, borrow money from private institutions. It was a hard decision for the ruler of the Qing Empire.
国家的命运，一国的，是吧？这个财政你交给其他的人负责，危险大不大？就跟一个家庭的财政一样，你交给员工来掌握，这个风险大不大？所以政府绝对不允许民间参足。
But at that moment, the government had no other option but to borrow money from private sectors. So at last, the Ministry of Finance decided to borrow money from institutions like money shops, private banks, pawn shops, and so on. In just a few months, private banks from all over the country lent a total of 1 million taels of silver to the government. At the same time, the finances of regional governments also had to depend on private banks.
地方政府拿不出那么多钱来，要赔赠外国人，但是呢，和外国人签订条约要限期把款项汇到上海的汇丰银行、花旗银行，这中间呢要不得不依靠票号，要票号来汇兑各个地方的筹款，归还外国人的所谓赔款，而且呢筹不起来还得向票号借款，垫着汇出去，这样的话票号 基本上成了清政府的财政支柱。
As a private financial institution, the banks played an unprecedented role and became the government's biggest creditor. During this period, The Chiao family's banks also became involved in these events. Meanwhile, Gao was promoted by Chiao as the general manager, the man in charge of Dadao Tong. After Gao became general manager, Dadao Tong's profits increased by leaps and bounds, and its reputation became more and more renowned. At its peak, its capital amounted to 7 million taels of silver, the highest among all the private banks in the county. The reliance of the government and trust from officials brought great wealth to Dadao Tong, but Gao was still a little worried because he knew that he was facing a government liable to change. In the second year after the government had approved the idea of exchanging expenditure capital through private banks, 10-year-old Emperor Tong met with several ministers. One of the officials reported that the price of silver in Beijing had suddenly risen. He thought the private banks were responsible for this situation. In his opinion, the banks weren't delivering silver to Beijing, so there was a reduction in the overall amount of silver in the capital, causing the prices to rise. Soon afterwards, the emperor ordered that private institutions would be forbidden from remitting governmental expenditure.
政府对这个票号是不放心的。为什么不放心呢？财不外露，才是最核心的掌握国家的命运。政府的命被民间掌握了，你还怎么领导民间？所以，一旦国家的政治军事形势好转，政府就限制票号。
Shortly after his decision, due to an internal crisis, the government had to rely on private banks to remit governmental expenditure once again. But once the situation had stabilized, the government would kick its partners out. In this way, the changeable government made their remittance business extremely unstable. As the general manager of Dadao Tong, Gao understood that the officials who were his friends would never give him their permanent backing and support. Having studied the situation, he tried to build connections with the supreme ruler. Then, just when he was racking his brains for ways to develop Dadao Tong, an opportunity quietly presented itself. In the autumn of 1900, a group of people progressed silently in suburban Beijing. No one knew that these people were the core ruling group of the Qing Empire. In the carriage was Empress Dowager Cixi, who had the real ruling power at the time. What they were doing was running to a place of safety, using the secret trade thoroughfare that few people knew about. Four months before, 8 countries, including Britain, France, Prussia, and Russia, joined forces to start an aggressive war against China that shocked the whole world. 2 months later, the eight-power Allied forces conquered Beijing, leading Emperor Guangxu, Cixi, and almost all the other core officials of the Qing Empire fled to the west of China on August 15. Bumping over high mountain ridges, they almost lost touch with all the regional officials. But in the compound of Dadao Tong, one man was fully aware of the whereabouts of his group of people. He was Gao Yu. Several days before, he had received a secret letter from someone in the inner cabinet. The letter said, "For your information, Empress Dowager Cixi and Emperor Guangxu will set out on the 8th day of the month, and we will pass by Qi County."
因为这些官员要替皇太后提前准备衣食住行嘛，需要找自己信得过的，我信得过，同时他还有钱，品德还好。
Being on good terms with Gao Yu, this official told Gao in advance of Cixi's whereabouts in a letter. This enabled Gao to make full preparations. Although he was experienced and well-informed, the letter surprised Gao. Even the Empress Dowager had fled from the Forbidden City. It meant that the situation was extremely critical. But on second thoughts, he knew that this might be a golden opportunity, and the Shanxi merchant made the most important decision of his whole life.
Gao Yu 已经得知这个消息，就通知票号东家和一路的纺织机构要照顾慈禧和皇上路过的经费问题。所以一路上呢，打切站的官员就和票号直接联系。
As the manager of a private business, why did Gao do this?
对民间来讲，能接待一个皇帝这是多高的机会，关系到我在社会的声誉。但同时呢，那么有这么一个机会对票号的发展也很有利。
Apart from providing all the expenses for Cixi and Guangxu on their journey, Gao also showed them a safe passageway that led to Shanxi. This wasn't a traditional public road, but a business route used by Shanxi merchants to travel between Shanxi and Beijing. Several days later, the supreme ruler of the Qing Empire entered the temporary palace set up by the Dadao Tong Bank.
Gao Yu 就提前得到了这个机会就跟乔致庸商量于是那么大家就非常隆重的接待慈禧太后这是很不得了的，皇帝到了谁家，这还得了这是无限的荣耀。
Their generous action greatly impressed the distressed Qing rulers. Because they had escaped in a hurry, they didn't take too much money with them. The governor of Shanxi called on all the commercial shops to raise money for the government.
但是票号这个时间不轻易上升政府了，为什么呢？你毕竟是政权处于风雨飘摇当中能不能活下去，大家不相信。一旦活不下去了，破产了，这笔钱就没有办法了。
While other merchants were still hesitating, the Dadao Hong Bank, owned by the Chiao family, immediately withdrew 300,000 taels of silver. This delighted the distressed dignitaries. As a result of this, Jia Jiying, the manager of Dadao Hong, was received by Empress Dowager Cixi, which foreshadowed his future accomplishments. Perhaps it was this timely assistance that moved Cixi. Soon after, they entered the temporary palace. A minister reported that it was not safe to deliver the silver in the midst of the turmoil, and asked for the money to be remitted to Taiyuan through private banks. Without the slightest hesitation, Cixi, who knew nothing about the remittance business, immediately approved and issued an edict to carry out the proposal. Just a few days later, one after another, remittances from all provinces arrived in banks in Pingyao and other counties. This continued for almost 3 years. The counties of Pingyao, Qi, and Taigu had once become the financial centers of China. Gao never expected that his decision during Cixi's runaway to the west would thoroughly change the relationship between private banks and the government. At 11 a.m. on September 7, 1901, at the Spanish embassy in Beijing, Rishengchang, the representative of the Chinese government, signed the Treaty of 1901 with 11 Western powers, including Britain, France, and Germany. China had endured numerous ravages and humiliations, yet it was China that was forced to pay the invaders 450 million taels of silver. This was called the Boxer Compensation. The total amount of the Boxer Compensation and Sino-Japanese War Compensation amounted to over 650 million taels of silver. Combined with war expenditure, the total amount of foreign debt reached 800 million. On top of this, the government had to pay the compensation by borrowing money. With interest, the financial loss was over 1 billion taels of silver.
庚子赔款是中国人民的一个很大的灾难，是列强对中国的一个巨大的一个掠夺。但是呢，在这个时候呢，票号呢，在这个庚子赔款的这个银两的这个汇兑当中，它反而扩大了它的业务。
The unprecedented crisis was a tremendous blow to Chinese industry and commerce. Businesses were in recession, and people's lives were miserable. During this troubled time, only private banks were doing well and making unprecedented profits. During this period, the bonus paid by the oldest bank, Rishengchang, was 12,000 taels of silver per share. The bonus paid by Wayne Associates was over 10,000 taels of silver per share. In 1908, not long before the Qing government fell, the bonus paid by Dadao Tong reached 17,000 taels of silver per share, almost 10 times the original bonus. This is a document recording the remittance of Boxer compensation through private banks in all provinces. Rishengchang, Dadao Tong, and other big banks are all listed. Relying on the abundant capital of private banks, the heavy financial burden of regional governments was effectively reduced, and the old lumbering giant of the Qing Empire could linger on without danger of immediate collapse. On the other hand, based on the remittance of national capital, private banks kept up a sufficient cash flow. By the last days of the late Qing dynasty, private banks and the government had become a pair of inseparable fellow sufferers. On August 1st, 1902, Empress Dowager Cixi returned from Baoding to Beijing on this train. Then she took an emperor's carriage, passed the Yongding Gate, and returned to the Forbidden City through the Jiangyang Gate. Later on, the Qing government issued an official edict approving private banks as the agents of governmental expenditure for the whole country. The ruler of the Qing Empire finally realized that apart from the officials who had various wavering thoughts and the fragile army, they could also rely on this group of rich Shanxi merchants. Later on, Chiao was granted by Cixi a rank equivalent to that of a provincial governor. The Chiao family became the first legal official merchants of the Qing dynasty. Chiao's compound also became the first official residence built by merchants. In 1905, an imperial commissioner entered the Taiyuan branch of the Dadao Bank, holding an imperial edict. The puzzled manager, Jia, kneeled down to receive the edict. He didn't know why the emperor would issue an edict to an ordinary manager like himself. According to the edict, the emperor was ordering Jia to go immediately to Beijing to take the position of general manager of the Bank of the Ministry of Finance, responsible for preparing the establishment of national banks. The reason 29-year-old Jia was entrusted with this important job was because of the warm hospitality he had shown during Cixi's escape. On July 1st, 1908, the Bank of the Ministry of Finance was renamed the Ta-Qing Government Bank. This is a group photo of officials and bankers attending the first conference after the bank was renamed. It's hard now to recognize which one is Jia, but as the first president of the bank, he is almost certainly in the photo. A 100 years after being established, private banks had finally gained their legal birth certificate and business license. From then on, private banks officially became the main operators of the whole country's finances. They took full charge of currency remittance from all other parts of the country, including the money submitted from and distributed to regional governments, customs, salt tax, and other income. After this, managers from major private banks often visited regional governments and associated with officials. Private banks monopolized the finances of the whole country and the operational power of war compensation. In the last years of the Qing dynasty, private banks, which had been developing for almost a century, were finally included into the governmental management system. They undertook the financial responsibility that the government lacked. Western economic invasions caused the collapse of a domestic private bank tycoon. China was facing the crisis of losing control of its own economy. Under such circumstances, what would private banks do to protect themselves? Join us for the next part, Trying Times.